Well, dear listeners, tonight the scent of burned coal and flesh blood will mingle in our imagination, and your throat may tighten as though a stove door had opened inside a chapel. A first question rose before any argument earned its collar. Did that odour ever belong to imagination at all, or did it arrive as inheritance, carried through cupboards where family linen lay folded beside old letters, carried through public corridors where decisions wore their Sunday manners? Smell holds custody with a pitiless sobriety. It behaves like evidence. It asks who signed for it, who profited from its passage, who rinsed their hands while it clung to the wrist like a ring. Imagination, in its respectable office hours, plays customs officer stamping horror as story, so it may enter the mind under supervision, while the body submits to a sterner statute. Smoke keeps an archive that outlives apology. Ash performs like a quiet solicitor, settling on lungs with the same discretion it grants to paper. Bruno Latour returned wearily, with the patience of a man watching the same civic ritual under altered vocabulary, to a scandal that modern Europe rehearsed as doctrine. Authority spoke as though nature waited outside the chamber to authenticate what the chamber had already willed. He treated that division as a superstition of procedure, a habit of mind that let committees dress appetite in the robes of inevitability. Under his gaze, facts never arrived alone. They travelled with instruments, budgets, experts, and a choreography of consent. Objectivity sounded less like purity and more like a style of governance, for it determined whose pain received a hearing and whose pain remained a footnote. You can hear the superstition in the little click of a recorder when the red eye warms and a throat clears, paper slides across a table, and the gesture carries a calm that resembles mercy. Language arrives dressed for work, clauses that behave like gloves, verbs that promise neutrality with the smile of a clerk who has memorized the rulebook. Under that polish, risk finds its address, hunger receives its portion, victory learns to speak in the accent of procedure. A form in Ireland can sound like an altar response, and a concept in Paris can perform the same rite with cleaner consonants, while both claim they merely describe. So the question turns juridical, even as it remains intimate. When catastrophe becomes collective, it seeks a lawful face. It enters through precedent, through compensation schedules, through the peculiar tenderness of public interest, which can bless a wound while keeping the hand that caused it out of view. Latour would have named this a problem of attachment, which beings count as parties when a contract claims the authority to govern reality. I kept thinking of that as I leaned toward the mic and felt the cable tug with the small insistence of a leash, while the ordinary world, counters, files, receipts, signatures, waited nearby with the patience of a creditor. The apocalypse, when it arrives as paperwork, asks for your consent with astonishing politeness. The first time I smelled coal as a moral substance, I had already learned, though the lesson had arrived through quieter papers, that earth could be owned in ways that exceeded the hand's grasp, and yet tightened around the throat with greater force than any fist. A seam of carbon lay under a field, and a man who never lifted a pick could claim the seam through ink, while the field's tenant, who watched his cabbages rise and fall with the seasons, could wake to find survey pegs in his furrows, since a declaration of public utility, signed at a desk far from the furrow, could pierce the surface with an authority that resembled fate. Under that sign a stream could be diverted, a road could be cut, a hillside could be drilled, and a household could be bled through litigation until a child, who had meant to grow toward leisure, grew toward account books, postponements, and the long ache of deferred settlement. I begin with this pressure, which Zola carried before he ever saw the black mouths of the north, since Germinal, when it opened its jaw upon the reader, carried a second jaw behind it, formed in Provence by a canal concession that had promised water to a city, while it had bequeathed to a widow the slow violence of court procedure. Zola's lineage, which publishers and enemies handled as though it were a specimen pinned under glass, offered him a paradoxical credential, since an Italian engineer father, whose ambition rose through the technical priesthood of bridges and dams, coupled with a French mother whose provincial tenacity withstood creditors and delays, produced a son who could write as both insider and suspect. The epoch loved lineage and feared it, as though blood were a portable archive that could be praised as heritage when it conformed to national myth and condemned as taint when it did not. Ernest Alfred Vizetelly, who assembled the family story with late Victorian relish, traced the Zola name through Lombardy, through soldiers, through Jesuit martyrdom, through a Catholic lineage that sounded almost theatrical, while his very accumulation of ancestral colour exposed the era's hunger to explain literature through birth. In such air, Germinal's declared physiology, its insistence upon heredity and milieu, absorbed a cultural obsession that surrounded the book even before the first chapter descended into le Voreux, since contemporaries greeted Zola's method as a kind of social autopsy whose scalpel threatened to cut through class decorum. A reader trained by later political myth tends to meet Germinal as the miner's scripture, while the novel, taken on its own terms, behaved as an inquiry into ownership's hidden organs, since the mine functioned as a body whose rights had been granted, traded and defended, and since the workers, whose lungs filled with dust, occupied a legal space shaped by concession, company housing, company store, and the armed protection of property. The company's claim formed an invisible canopy over every gesture, although the canopy rarely appeared as explicit statute, since Zola trusted consequence while he allowed the law to speak through the price of bread, through the landlord's threat, through the soldier's rifle held across a road. That choice, which critics have taken as mere narrative economy, grew from an earlier domestic education, since the boy Émile had lived amid the afterlife of his father's concession, where the right to expropriate, the right to take water, the right to complete a dam, had turned into a grind of petitions and hearings that devoured the household's small reserves. When a child watches adults whisper over papers at a table that used to hold supper, the child learns that ownership speaks softly while it moves mountains. The paternal figure François Zola entered the 19th century's faith in engineering with the zeal of a man who believed that geometry could redeem politics, since water, brought to Aix by a canal, promised health, commerce and civic pride. Viztelli describes how the engineer gained official recognition of public utility, how he obtained powers of expropriation, how the city council haggled over valuations, and how opponents, fortified by local interests, pressed disputes into committee and court. The engineer's ambition, admirable in its technical courage, carried a shadow that Germinal would later translate into tragedy, since expropriation, even when wrapped in the language of public good, still displaced a prior claim, while it taught those affected that the state could place its seal upon seizure. A household living inside that conflict would absorb a double lesson. Progress promised salvation, while progress also arrived as sanctioned intrusion. Germinal's mind repeated the lesson under harsher light, since the company's right to the seam behaved as a perpetual expropriation of the worker's future, while the hunger that followed wage reduction became the most intimate form of dispossession. Since the father died before the canal could mature into stable income, the concession's aftertaste lingered as litigation, and litigation, when it becomes a family climate, alters a child's sense of time. Viztelli writes of lawsuits that dragged on, of money drained by procedural delay, of moves to cheaper rooms, of furniture sold, of a grandmother's small sacrifices that carried the smell of quiet humiliation. Germinal's pacing, which readers often attribute to epic design, gained here a more private source, since a boy who had watched justice stretch into years would later write a novel in which the poor, trapped between payday and hunger, experienced time as an instrument wielded by those who owned the schedule. The company in Germinal controlled the calendar through wages and credit, while the state controlled the calendar through repression, and the miners' revolt, which swelled into collective motion, still encountered the slow, grinding return of authority that knew how to wait. I hear behind Germinal's pithead sounds the rustle of documents, the scraping of a quill, the measured voice of an official reading terms whose cadence turned the earth into an asset. Zola's naturalism, so often summarized as a method of observation, carried also a method of inheritance. He observed the miner's body with the intensity of a physician, while he observed the social body with the cold patience of a clerk who had watched his mother bargain with necessity. When Etienne Lantier entered the miners' settlement and found that housing, food, and even the smallest pleasures passed through the company's hands, the reader encountered a feudal structure rendered in industrial materials, since the lord's manor had become the director's office, and the tithe had become the store's credit ledger. That structure offered a more radical interpretation than the familiar one, since it suggested that Germinal's target lay less in capital as an abstract system and more in ownership as a transhistorical spell, which could dress itself as monarchy, republic, corporation, or public utility, while it continued to press bodies into service. Jules Lemaitre, writing in the season of Germinal's reception, sensed the epic weight of Zola's work, and he called the Rougon-Macquart project an épopée pessimiste de l'animalité humaine, while he praised the narrative's powerful slowness and its recurring breath of the mind. His phrase, which later criticism repeated with comfortable familiarity, has often been used to steer interpretation toward biology and away from jurisprudence, as though Zola's miners were driven chiefly by appetite and instinct. Yet epic, since Homer, has concerned itself with the distribution of land and the legitimization of dominion, while it has treated violence as the instrument by which ownership becomes real. When Lemaitre heard epic in Germinal, he heard, perhaps without naming it, the ancient argument over who may claim the fruits of the earth, and he heard that argument returning through modern machinery, since the mind's respiration functioned as the breath of a legal monster whose lungs had been granted rights that exceeded the human lungs it consumed. Octave Mirbeau, who possessed a satirist's cruelty and an admirer's involuntary respect, attacked naturalism for its obsession with detail, and he mocked the school as lécheurs de détails, whose gaze fixed on surfaces risked degrading art into inventory. Mirbeau's barb, when turned toward Germinal with care, reveals an inverse truth, since Zola's details behave as conduits through which the law enters sensation. Bread rations, tools, wages, rent arrears, the feel of wet clothes after a shift, the taste of coffee thinned into bitterness, all become the living translation of contract and concession. The reader who follows only the sociological dimension may treat these particulars ethnography, while the reader who follows their consequence sees how ownership, though it speaks in abstract terms, makes itself felt as cold, as fatigue, as fear of eviction, as a child's hollow cheeks. Under that lens, Mirbeau's critique becomes testimony that Zola had built a new kind of chronicle, one in which the legal order left fingerprints on every spoon and every bruise. The socio-cultural ether of the 1880s, saturated with strike anxiety, Republican pride, and the fear of contagion, moral, political, even microbial, gave Germinal a reception that behaved like a fever chart. Newspapers and salons argued over whether Zola had incited revolt, while they also argued over whether his depiction of miners violated propriety. The same era that proclaimed the dignity of the people also feared the people's appetite, and it tended to treat poverty as an element that required management through discipline. Germinal entered this climate during a period when industrial conflicts, including the strikes in the northern coal basin, had already taught bourgeois France that the pit could produce politics as surely as it produced fuel. Under such conditions, Zola's lineage mattered, since an author whose father had sought expropriation powers in the name of public utility could be accused of hypocrisy when he denounced corporate domination, while an author whose household had been wounded by legal delay could be understood as speaking from lived resentment. The era preferred simple moral portraits. Zola offered a figure shaped by complicity and injury at once. Here lies the singular detail, whose presence has long sat in biographies like an overlooked stone in a pocket. The paternal concession's explicit authority to expropriate, which the family story often presents as a neutral administrative fact, formed Zola's first intimate contact with lawful seizure. Since the engineer's project depended upon taking land and water under official permission, the child inherited in the family name an association with sanctioned appropriation, and that association, even when it yielded financial hardship later, still placed the household inside the moral ambiguity of progress. Germinal's traditional interpretation, which casts Zola as the miner's advocate confronting alien capital, shifts under this recognition, since the novel becomes a form of self-indictment in which the author, bearing the memory of a father who had sought powers of taking, turned his art upon the mechanism that had once promised to elevate his own family. Under this reading, Germinal's anger ceases to function as purely external compassion. It becomes internal penance, the son's attempt to purge a familial inheritance of expropriation by staging its consequences in their most savage clarity. Such penance would explain the novel's peculiar balance between sympathy and severity. Zola loved his miners with a surgeon's devotion, while he also exposed their cruelty, their sexual rivalries, their susceptibility to rumour and violence, since he refused to sanctify them as icons. The refusal has troubled readers who wish for political purity, yet it makes sense when Germinal is read as an atonement narrative. Penance requires truth, and truth requires that the oppressed remain human, with all the disorder that humanity entails. Etienne Lantier, who arrives with revolutionary ideas and moral hunger, carries the genealogy of the Rougon-Macquart system, which binds him to inherited weakness, while his attempt at leadership becomes both admirable and compromised. The mine, meanwhile, remains the ultimate inheritor, since it receives bodies as offerings, and it returns wages as thin absolution. Zola's earlier domestic lesson, papers can devour a household, returns as a collective apocalypse. A concession can devour a whole region. The epoch's chronicles, read alongside the novel, expose how quickly contemporaries sensed the danger of such a portrayal. Critics who claimed aesthetic neutrality often slipped into political anxiety, since they feared that description could become instruction. Zola's defenders insisted upon his observational courage, while his detractors accused him of wallowing in filth, as though the poor were obligated to remain unseen for the comfort of the well-fed. In this quarrel, the question of ownership hovered like smoke. Who owned the right to represent the people? Who owned the language in which the people could appear? Who owned the narrative of progress? Zola's lineage, again, mattered, since a man whose father had been an engineer of public works could be expected to praise modern industry, while the son instead wrote a novel in which modern industry reproduced feudal relations under a republican flag. That reversal, driven by the expropriation memory, offers the radical shift. Germinal becomes the book in which progress indicts itself through the mouth of its own descendant. I have watched in provincial archives the way a single clause in a concession can rearrange a landscape, since a phrase such as public utility can function as sacrament, granting the state a liturgical authority to transform fields into infrastructure. Once the phrase is spoken, resistance becomes framed as selfishness, and a farmer defending a spring can be portrayed as an enemy of the common good. Zola's father moved within that sacramental language, while Zola's novel breaks the sacrament open and shows its blood. The company in Germinal claims economic necessity. It claims national interest. It claims the stability of markets. It claims, in effect, a public utility of coal. The miner's hunger, counterposed against these claims, exposes the sacrament's cost, since the common good, defined by owners, demands that the poor serve as fuel. When Zola wrote The Mine as a Beast, he wrote a theological parody, a modern idol that requires offerings, whose priests speak in numbers, whose rites culminate in funerals. A further consequence follows, which alters the novel's ending. Germinal's close, with its subterranean imagery of seeds swelling in the earth and men rising in springtime, has often been read as revolutionary prophecy, the promise that the oppressed will eventually prevail. Under the inheritance reading, the ending becomes stranger and more ambiguous, since penance rarely yields clean consolation. A son who writes against the mechanism that once promised to feed his household can imagine uprising, while he also senses the mechanism's persistence, since law outlives individual revolt. The seeds in the soil belong to the same earth that contains coal. The season's renewal belongs to the same calendar that owners manipulate. Hope rises while ownership adapts. Zola's image remains powerful, though it begins to sound less like triumph and more like a recurring pressure that refuses to accept enclosure, the pressure that may erupt again and again, while the structures above ground rebuild their fences with new materials. The socio-cultural ether of the period, with its republican rhetoric of fraternity, becomes under this lens a stage for an older drama. France spoke of citizens, while it continued to tolerate a system in which property determined life chances with the implacable certainty of a caste. Germinal exposes this contradiction through bodies, since the miners, formerly equal under law, remain materially bound under ownership. A child's education under litigation taught Zola that formal equality and lived equality diverge sharply, since a concession can grant power to one party while procedure delays redress for another. This divergence appears in the novel when the miners who attempt negotiation encounter paternalistic speeches and slow concessions that arrive too late, while hunger drives them toward violence. Violence, in turn, allows the state to appear as guardian of order, thereby reinforcing the owner's legitimacy. The cycle resembles the logic of expropriation disputes. The powerful frame themselves as agents of improvement, while they portray resistance as disorder, and they rely upon time and procedure to exhaust opponents. I have spoken of lineage as though it were a chain, though it behaves more like a stain that spreads through fabric. Zola's Italian paternal origin, his Provençal childhood, his Parisian ambition, all combine into a writer who stood in multiple rooms at once. The miners of the north, though distant from Aix, became kin to him through the shared experience of being acted upon by systems that claimed virtue. The canal's promise of water and the mine's promise of fuel share a rhetorical architecture. Both projects claim necessity, both claim benefit, both require bodies to bear cost. In Zola's household, the cost arrived through the slow drain of lawsuits and the humiliation of reduced circumstances. In Germinal's households, the cost arrives through hunger, injury, and death. The scale expands, while the mechanism remains recognizable, and that recognition, once grasped, shifts the novel's moral center. Germinal becomes a meditation on how lawful taking, when sanctified as utility, breeds revolt as a natural reaction, as though the earth itself had grown tired of being owned. A lecture, once it reaches this point, ought to offer a firm conclusion, since audiences crave closure as they crave warmth on a winter evening. Yet Germinal resists closure, since its power lies in its refusal to allow any single party to possess the last word. The company retains resources, the miners retain rage, the state retains weapons, the earth retains its slow, indifferent transformations. Zola, carrying the memory of expropriation authority in his father's story, writes with a divided tongue, since he condemns ownership's cruelty, while he recognizes that modern life runs on the very resources ownership extracts. That division, once acknowledged, deepens the novel's tragedy, since the reader confronts complicity alongside sympathy. Coal warms homes, coal also kills miners. Water nourishes cities, water projects also displace claims. Progress feeds bodies, progress also devours bodies. Zola's pen, sharpened by domestic litigation, cut into the comfortable narrative that modernity had offered about itself. You may feel, as the pages close, that the mind's breath continues in your own lungs, and that the legal canopy above the pit continues above every street where property decides who sleeps indoors. Germinal, seen through inherited law, becomes less a monument to a single strike and more a confession about the human habit of blessing seizure with noble vocabulary. The confession extends beyond France, beyond the 19th century, beyond any single ideology, since ownership continues to shape the moral weather, while each generation learns new words for the same old act of taking. The book ends with seeds swelling under the fields, and I leave you there, where growth and burial share the same soil, where a clause in a concession can still rearrange a life, where a spring can still rise under pressure until stone fractures, where the count of the dead refuses any final arithmetic, since the earth keeps receiving, and the earth keeps giving, and the account remains open in a ledger whose last line never arrives.